Ever since I started playing this game and joined its community, there's always been one idea that I see talked about somewhat often, and I can't help but feel like people don't really know what they're talking about whenever it comes to why you should be insane and don't starve together. This is one of the bigger misconceptions that I see new to moderate players have in regards to managing one's sanity, and more often than not, I don't see them understand why this is or isn't true, so I kind of wanted to put out a video on why you should not be insane and don't starve together. Being insane is probably the biggest nuisance in Don't Starve by far, and I'm very tired of seeing people say otherwise. I think the biggest thing that perpetuates this idea of you should always be insane is the rather infamous video by Edgy Rick, and as a result, I want to talk about the point in which he makes. That being, primarily, nightmare fuel is used in tons of recipes. To go over them quickly and give you a somewhat brief overview, using the Shadow Manipulator, which is a crafting station, a one-man band, which befriends pigs and talks to plants, a nightlight, which provides light for nightmare fuel, a life-giving amulet, which revives you, Sleepy Time Stories, which is a wicker book that puts nearby mobs to sleep, shadow armor, which is armor, dark swords, which are probably one of the best weapons in the game, a nightmare amulet, which turns you insane while you're wearing it, a fire staff, which sets fires, a telelocator, which teleports to a telelocator focus, a belt of hunger, which makes you starve slower, a thulecite medallion, which tells the phases of the ruins, the magiluminescence, which has an increased movement speed and light radius, the construction amulet, which halves the cost of crafts while you have it on, the starcaller staff, which puts down a star, the deconstruction staff, which gives full resources back on an item, the lazy forager picks up nearby items, the lazy explorer is a walking cane with a short range teleport, the thulecite crown and armor are both armors, obviously. The thulecite club, which is a small movement speed weapon. The Abigail's flower, which spawns Abigail, the super insanity circuit, which is WX's increased sanity circuit. The Codex Umbra, which is Maxwell's book. First round, which is Walter ammo. The Grim Galette, which is a food item that swaps sanity and health. Timepieces, which is used in Wanda stuff. The Alarming Clock, which is a strong Wanda weapon. And refueling things like bone armor, the magiluminescence, and things of that nature. Lots of things use up nightmare fuel in this game, and all of these are pretty useful and handy, and I'd recommend getting them if you can. They're real strong for the most part. However, here's the issue with the mentality that you should be insane constantly. Making these items is only parts of the crafting recipe, and a small part of the game as a whole. Due to the sheer volume of stuff that you should be doing in this game, having to constantly deal with nightmare creatures is a huge detriment. With the way nightmare creatures spawn, you are almost forced to deal with them if you want to do anything in a stationary location for anything short of dropping items. Nightmare creatures also spawn pretty frequently when you're insane, being able to spawn anywhere on screen, and if they spawn ahead of you, there's a very real and pretty likely possibility that they just cut you off and hit you for free damage. Killing nightmare fuels isn't terribly difficult, however, having a kiting pattern that isn't terribly difficult to deal with one exception. Dealing with multiple nightmare creatures can result in stray hits every so often when they teleport on top of you. That, paired with the fact that you have to simultaneously kite another nightmare creature, often leads to damage that is incredibly difficult to avoid, if not just outright impossible. Don't even get me started on servers with multiple people in them. You have to be at about half sanity in order to spawn nightmare creatures to taunt you, but you have to be pretty low sanity in order to actually fight them. What this tends to result in is, in servers with multiple people, other people are going to spawn nightmare creatures without being able to deal with them. But nightmare creatures are going to notice and aggro onto the one person who is actually below that threshold. So you're not just dealing with your own nightmare creatures in that scenario, you're dealing with yours and the ones of the people around you. That, paired with the fact that each player can spawn up to 2 nightmare creatures at a time, means that you're just going to get swarmed incredibly easily. Going back to the crafting of the items, there's also the issue of you only ever really make a small amount of items early on in this list. You know, you make the Shadow Manipulator to make the Dark Sword and maybe a life-giving amulet. Then, depending on your preferences, you might make something like a one-man band and a Sleepy Time Stories if you're Wicker Bottom, or maybe you'll make like a telelocator staff and focus, but none of that is really guaranteed. The only thing you consistently use Nightmare Fuel on is Dark Swords and life-giving amulets, if you even use the life-giving amulets to begin with. The biggest drain is the Dark Sword. Most of the other items that are really strong on this list tend to be Ruins gear, which, if you've ever been to the Ruins, you know that Nightmare Fuel is not something that's difficult to get down there. In fact, typically, you want to be sane so that you don't spawn any more additional enemies while in the Ruins so that you don't get overwhelmed. Ultimately, it's just a matter of being forced to deal with the nightmare creatures around you, versus dealing with the nightmare creatures in the location in question. So being insane isn't necessarily something that's desirable, and I think the reason should be obvious, right? You're constantly dealing with them, they're constantly taking away time from other things that you could be setting up, and that's just really annoying. It's not something that you want to be doing, but nightmare fuel itself is still desirable for some of the things that you do craft. So, how do you go about getting the nightmare fuel? There are a couple of really good options that are alternatives to just being insane, and I want to cover them. Probably one of, if not the best method to get nightmare fuel is through the Shadow Piece farm. To give a brief overview, you just need to craft tons of statues using the Shadow Piece figure sketches, load a large amount of knights onto a boat, then kill the bishop and the rook separately. The knights will be stuck on the boat, in which you could safely detonate them from a distance using a fire staff and gunpowder, or you could use catapults to kill them. This will cause each knight to die at tier 3, resulting in them dropping up to 13 nightmare fuel each, and a guaranteed 1 shadow armor, dark sword, and the shadow atrium. This not only gives you that precious nightmare fuel that you use for some of the best items in the game, but they also give you what is easily the biggest drain of nightmare fuel in as large of a quantity as you want, that being dark swords. In running this farm, you ensure that you have all the shadow atriums that you need to fight Fuel Weaver at most any given point in time, and dark swords to last you tons and tons of time. The Shadow Armor also helps tremendously with things like Celestial Champion as your primarily armor sword. This farm is a big drain on rocks and statue materials, however, but once you put in the initial materials to make the statues, breaking them every time afterwards will give you back the statue materials that you made them with, aside from the rocks required to sculpt the actual statues. It's highly recommended that you run this farm when you can, and rather than waste time being insane, I'd recommend you just rush this instead, and just get the need for nightmare fuel out of the way quick and easy. The next one is something that I think is pretty niche, all things considered, but is still relatively useful, and that is the Shadow Spelunky farm. I'd recommend doing this with Winona, but you could just pen in Spelunkies and use anemones to automate killing them. Shadow Spelunkies will drop nightmare fuel and beard hair, and due to the large amount of Spelunkies that are located in the entrance to the ruins, you can easily get set up for nightmare fuel by running this farm. The beard hair will also take care of any resurrection needs in the form of meat effigies, letting you revive yourself at a predetermined location that you can have as a sort of safety net. Overall, meat effigies are really nice to have in this game. But ultimately, I feel like the statement that you should always be insane is just flawed because of the fact that the alternatives exist and are typically better. It's much easier and much more beneficial in the long run to be sane than it is to be insane, and you should only ever really be insane when you need the nightmare fuel for certain things, but you should really just be focusing on getting the shadow pieces set up. In my opinion, shadow pieces are the end goal for nightmare fuel farms, and I think the fact that it exists and is as good as it is kind of just blows the idea of always being insane out of the water. Because that's time you could spend setting up that farm in addition to anything else you might want to set up. But yeah, I just wanted to go over why you should not be insane and Don't Starve Together. Subscribe if you haven't, I really do appreciate it. And so, until next time. Bye-bye.